So we've seen why Frege thinks the million theory is wrong. He thinks we have to avoid at all costs this bad prediction that whenever two names refer to the same thing, they must have the same meaning. Because if we don't, unless we say that, unless we avoid that, we're going to run into the problems we saw in the last video. But how does Frege solve this problem? What is the meaning of a name? How do we get out of this problem of saying names that refer to the same thing mean the same thing? What Frege wants to do to solve this problem is say that there's an extra element to meaning beyond just what the words refer to or stand for. And he calls this extra element the sense of a word. So it's right there in the title of the paper, sense and reference. And really it's sense that's kind of the new thing. Reference is something people thought was there all along. So what is sense? Well, for one thing, it's kind of a bit like connotation. So as you'll see as we go along, there are some pretty clear similarities between the way that Mill talked about the connotation of words like gold and human, and the way that Frege thinks about the sense of words in general. But Frege never exactly gives a definition of the word sense, so we have to just sort of... And he maybe thought it wasn't possible to give it a definition. So the best we can do is just focus on certain things he says and try to take from those passages what we think he had in mind. And probably the most illuminating place where he talks about sense is where he talks about sense as something like a mode of presentation. And he focuses on an example of the morning star and the evening star. So as a matter of fact, these are names for the same thing. The star that appears in the morning, it's the same as the first star that appears in the evening. And actually, neither of them are stars at all. It's the planet Venus. So these are names for the same thing. Let's draw a quick picture of that. So we have the name the morning star, and the name the evening star. And as we now know, they stand for the same thing. The planet Venus. So there's clearly some element of the meanings of these words which is shared. They refer to the same thing. But remember, we need to say that there's more to the meaning than just what they stand for. And Frege's answer is, well, the reason why this word or this expression means something different is because it has a different sense. And thinking through this example kind of gives us a better grip on what he might have meant by sense. Because what he says here is that, well, even though the expressions refer to the same thing, let's put it here, Venus, they do involve different ways of thinking about the same thing. So the morning star, its meaning seems to include a way of thinking about Venus as the thing that appears in the morning, and the evening star seems to involve a way of thinking about the object where it's something like the star that appears in the evening, or the heavenly body that appears in the evening. So the sense, which we might write here, is something like appears in the morning, and the sense of the evening star is something like appears in the evening. So here, in this picture, these words are not only referring to things, but we're sort of referring to them via a particular way of thinking about the object. So here we're thinking about it as the thing that appears in the morning, here we're thinking about it as the thing that appears in the evening. And clearly these are different ways of thinking about the same thing. It might be the same object, but they're different ways of thinking about it. And this is exactly why, in an example like this, Frege thinks that these names mean different things, because they involve different ways of thinking about the object. There's a further important thing here as well, which is, in some sense it seems like Frege thinks that the way of thinking about the object determines what you're thinking about in the first place. So it's because this means something like appears in the morning, that's why it gets to refer to the planet Venus. And it's because you're thinking of this as something, it's because this word involves something like appears in the evening, that fixes the meaning or fixes the reference of the planet Venus as the reference of the expression. So not only is the sense of sort of a way of thinking about the object, it seems like he's thinking it also, the sense determines the reference. And in fact, we get this bigger picture where, as we might say, the relationship between sense and reference is many-one. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's start with the big picture. The big picture is sort of like, well, we have a word that has a sense, and what the particular sense is determines what the object stands for, or what the referent is. And these are both parts of the meaning of the word. Just like connotation and reference were both part of the meanings of the word for Mill, whenever something has them both. But for Frege, it's sort of the sense that's doing most of the work, because once you have the sense, it's the sense that determines everything else. So for instance, the fact that the word the evening star has the sense, or comes with the mode of presentation, the star that appears in the evening, that's what determines what its referent is. And we've already seen some interesting things about the relationship between sense and reference. Because we've seen that two words can have different senses and still have the same referent. So our example of the morning star and the evening star was an example like this. And the reason for this is because, well, there can be different ways of thinking about the same thing. We saw that with the morning star and the evening star. Also see in a moment, that's also the solution in the Clark Kent and Superman case. The solution is going to be that the name Clark Kent has associated with it a different way of thinking about the object than Superman, even though it turns out that those ways of thinking about something are ways of thinking about the same thing. So we can have two words with different senses, but with the same referent. So even if we know that the senses are different, it still might be that they refer to the same thing. So the question might be, when you have different senses, does that automatically mean different reference? And the answer is no. Sometimes two words have different senses but the same referent, because the two senses, or the two ways of thinking about an object, actually pick out the same thing. We might also ask about the reverse. If you have different reference, do you have different senses? And here Frege's answer is actually yes. So if you have different references, if you have different reference, then you must also have different senses. If two words stand for different things, then their senses must also be different. Because remember, as Frege seems to be thinking about it, the sense of a word is something that fixes its referent. It's sort of like a recipe. Another way of thinking about it is the sense is like a recipe for finding what the referent is. So if you end up with different reference, then you must have been using different recipes, i.e. different senses, to find those referents. So while you can have different senses with the same referent, different reference mean the senses must also be different. So the big picture view is that there's this much more complicated picture of meaning. We have sense and we have reference. And these two things aren't independent of each other. The sense in particular, so if you know what the sense of a word is, and you say you know everything about the world, then you're going to be able to determine what the referent is. Because the sense is something that determines the referent. We saw this in our example with the evening star and the morning star. The sense, or the way of thinking about the object as the star that appears in the morning, that fixes the fact that the expression talks about the planet Venus, because that's the thing that appears in the morning. So that's a bit about sense. Now, I appreciate it's probably not 100% clear what the theory is, because, as I say, Frege never actually gives us like a full definition of what it is. He just tells us a bunch of things about it that help us sort of latch onto it. But we've learned a lot so far. So we've learned that senses are supposed to be something like a way of thinking about an object. You can have two words with different senses and the same referent, but you can't have it the other way around. If two objects have different referents, then they must have different senses. Because another way of thinking about sense is that sort of like a recipe for figuring out what the referent is. And if the referents are different, then the recipes must also be different. That's what the theory is, but why does this help us at all with our problem that we started with? How does this fix the problem that we saw in our Clark Kent and Superman example? Well, let's go back to that example now. So let's first remember what we said. We said that, so take these two sentences. We want to be able to say that these sentences mean different things. That's what we're trying to explain. Now, we already know that these two bits of it mean the same. So really what we're trying to do is we're trying to come up with a way of explaining or making sense of the fact that these names mean different things. Because if we don't, if we say that they really just mean the same thing, then we have all these problems. We have that these two sentences mean the same when it seems like they don't, and we also have the problem with the Lois Lane knows examples. And Frege thinks, so obviously he didn't use this particular example, but Frege thinks that the use of sense and reference fixes the problem here. Because on his theory, the word Superman does not mean the same thing as the word Clark Kent. Even though it is true in his theory that they pick out the same object, that they refer to the same thing. And the reason why they don't mean the same thing is because, remember, there are two elements to meaning on Frege's picture. There is reference, but there's also sense. And we said that even when two objects have the same reference, they may have different senses. That's what we saw in the evening star, morning star example. And that's exactly what Frege is thinking is going on in this example. So let's take the name Superman and compare it to the name Clark Kent. So as we said before, they stand for the same guy, who actually happens to be Superman. But crucially, the names involve different ways of thinking about the same object. So Superman is something like guy with a cape and superpowers. That's the sense of Superman. The sense of Clark Kent is very different. The sense of Clark Kent is something like guy with glasses is a journalist. That's actually about most of what I know about Clark Kent versus Superman. But you can see that if something like these are supposed to be the senses of the two names, then the senses are very different. These are two very different ways of thinking about the same object. They are obviously different ways of thinking about the same object, but here we're thinking about the object in very different ways. Here we're thinking of it as a guy who flies around with a cape. Here we're thinking of it as a guy who wears glasses and works for a newspaper. And we might think, and importantly, we might think of the same object in these two different ways without knowing that we're thinking about the same object. So when we think about Superman as the guy who flies around with the superpowers, we might not know that when we're thinking about the guy who works in the Daily Comet and has glasses, that we're actually thinking about the same guy. So the two senses are very different, even though they have the same referent. And in fact, we might use the two words, and we might understand their meanings because we understand their senses, without knowing that the reference is the same. But anyway, hopefully now you see enough to see why he solves the problem with this example. We can't just assume that these two words mean the same thing because they stand for the same object. We need to ask, well, do they also have the same sense? And whatever sense is supposed to be, it's pretty clear that in the example of Superman and Clark Kent, that the senses are going to be different. The sense for Superman, the way of thinking about Superman that's involved in this name, is very different from the way of thinking about that same person that's involved in the name Clark Kent. So different senses, so the words mean different things, so the sentences mean different things. That's how sense is supposed to help solve the problem with identity that we introduced in the last video.